Reptiles are wicked, and amphibians, they're awesome too. And today we're going to talk about the 5 best amphibians that you can keep as pets. From a little bit harder to keep to super simple, let's talk about them all. I'm Adam, you're watching Wicked's Wicked Reptiles. Stick around. Amphibians are very different than reptiles for a multitude of reasons. We're going to do a video in a few weeks discussing the two differences between them, or the difference between the two different types of species and their families. But I think with amphibians, a lot of the times it just adds certain elements that reptiles can't give you. Amphibians a lot of the time have a porous skin. A lot of the times they don't need a UVB light. There's a lot of really cool things about amphibians that really don't apply to reptiles, and a lot of things about reptiles that don't apply to amphibians. So let's go through the 5 best amphibians that you can keep as pets, and we'll start off with number 5, axolotls. And the reason that they're so high up on the list, or not number 1 anyway, is because they are a little bit more difficult to keep. There's more involved with keeping an axolotl than there is, say, I don't know, a Pacman frog or something like that. So the main difference is they're completely aquatic, which they're the only one on the list that is completely aquatic for today's list. These guys don't need a land source at all. They don't need any turtle dock, nothing. They just need a water source that stays between a very slim margin of temperatures, right? And if you get them above 72 to 74 degrees, you're getting to a danger zone with them as well. So you do have to keep it pretty cool with these guys, and I think that can be a challenge if you live in a part of the country that gets warm during the summer months. And by a part of the country, I mean basically anywhere unless you live in none of it. So let's go ahead and talk about axolotls just a little bit. These guys are a salamander species, a fully aquatic salamander. They don't get huge, sometimes up to 10, maybe 12 inches for a gigantic specimen. But what's really cool with these guys is they can regenerate limbs. And if you want to know all about axolotls, we did a video a few months ago all about them. I've got 2. I've got Lumi and Scuttle. Lumi's really cool because he glows in the dark. It's a really interesting genetic type that not a lot of amphibians have, which allows them to glow under a blue or black light. So there are a few morphs, but even just the wild-caught ones look very cool in my opinion. They have this granity type texture look to them. And with these guys, it's a water cycle issue. That's why they're so high on the list, because with axolotls, they're kind of sensitive. And you need to make sure that your aquarium is cycled quite substantially. This could take up to a few months. Sometimes we had our tank for about 6 weeks before we put anything in it. And then, of course, if you put sand so that you can make it look nice with real plants, it's a lot harder to cycle and have the chemistry in the water correct. And then if you have a bare bottom, it's easier, but it doesn't look as nice. So there's less options with these guys, in my opinion. Or if you want to use all the options available, it takes a lot more work than the rest. So number 5 is axolotls. Number 4, closely related to axolotls, tiger salamanders. And the reason they're on the list is, well, look at them. These are beautiful. Just the coolest looking salamander in my opinion. They're the largest land-dwelling salamander in the entire world. So I do suggest giving them a water source, but they don't need a giant water basin for them to submerge themselves in. They're going to be buried in the substrate a lot of the time. But I've noticed in my experience with pet shops that I know, or reptile shops, and then people who have them in their collections, that they do move around quite a bit, and you're going to be able to see them quite a bit as well, unlike, I don't know, some other sand boa or something like that, where it's almost always buried in the sand or the substrate. These nocturnal insectivores get between 6 and 9 inches, so similar size to an axolotl, but they do have limbs that they walk on land with, and I don't know that they regenerate them quite like an axolotl would. I do know that they drop their tails, but they've got this black and yellow pattern. Very cool. I would love to have one of these in my collection. I just don't really have the space for something like this. And because the temperature and humidity levels are very easy to maintain, especially the temperature levels, this is kind of, I would say, a more beginner type of species that you could keep. So if you don't have a ton of experience and you want to get something that is truly impressive, tiger salamanders are a go-to. So let's move on from tiger salamanders, which are one of the more popular types of amphibians that are kept a lot in the pet trade, and sometimes you can even find at a pet store rather than a reptile shop. And let's move on to number 3, Firebellied toads. And these guys are a small type of toad that do most of their living on land. Of course, give them a water receptacle. They do have porous skin. These guys have an amazing coloration. They're from Asia, parts of Asia, And they are very popular in the pet trade because of how they look, right? They look very interesting, and they're very interesting to watch feed and just move around. And I know a guy, he's got a bunch of these. They do really well in cohabitation groups, in larger enclosures, of course. If you're going to have just a few, you can get away with the 10-gallon. But a buddy of mine, he's got a 40-gallon with a ton of them in there. Well, not a ton, but probably 6 or 7 of them. And just watching them hop around, and they do swim a little bit and try to eat the crickets, it's really cool to watch. They do a lot of moving around, where the gripe with ball pythons or sand boas or a lot of really popular snake species is that they don't move around and it's like a pet rock. Well, you're not getting a pet rock with a firebelly toad. You're getting something that looks like it's on a sugar high all the time. It is very interesting to watch. I could not recommend them enough. These guys are very close to room temperature to keep them right where they want to be. And I think with a lot of amphibians, you're going to have a cooler temperature than you would need with a lot of reptile species, which I think is a really great option if you're not too sure that you want to keep something super tropical and impressive, but you just want something for you, for the corner of your room, on your dresser, whatever. Firebelly toads are definitely a go-to for that, in my opinion. So number 3 is firebelly toads. Alright, number 2, let's get into the big boys. Pacman frogs. This was very difficult not to put at number 1, and the reason is they don't need a big enclosure. They are kind of like a pet rock, so that's kind of what put them a little bit lower. So you're going to see them in the same spot for days on end. They only eat a few times a week if you feed them insects, and then as they get larger, which they do get quite large, I believe females get up to 7 inches sometimes, males a lot smaller, they are going to eat pinky mice if you let them. And they do have a crazy feeding response. It is super fun to watch, and their mouth looks like it opens up like Pacman. That's where they got their name. Like, it almost looks like their whole body opens up when their mouth opens up. So it's very impressive. It looks very different in comparison to a lot of other species, and I think that's what makes them really popular. Also, they come in a few different morphs as well, which in my opinion is awesome, because then you could, if you really like them, you could have a couple of them, they don't look the same, or you could have something that looks like it definitely wasn't from the wild, which is what a lot of people like to do with different species of amphibians and reptiles, of course. You know, just as an example, we've got leopard gecko here, and then there's one here, and they don't look the same at all, right? Because there's a lot of different morphs for leopard geckos, and the same thing goes with a lot of species of amphibians. Not as much, but Pacman frogs have several, at least 3 that I know of, and I think they're a great option because they don't take a lot of space. Darn near room temperature, between 75 and 80 is, from what I gather, the best spot to have them at. Humidity is a little bit more moderate, and as long as you have a substrate that they can kind of bury themselves in and a water receptacle big enough for them to get into, you're golden. So, number 2, Pacman frogs. And that brings us to number 1. The winner, in my opinion, whatever that's supposed to mean, of the best amphibian to keep as a pet, and that are tree frogs. And I guess I should say those are tree frogs, because I'm talking about a very wide range. The only experience that I have personally with keeping in my collection are American green tree frogs, which I think are great because they're small, they take a small space, so they don't really take a lot of footprint, a big room in your house, right? But they do jump around quite a bit. They make a croaking sound sometimes, but it doesn't get annoying. Like, I've got a zebra finch upstairs, and I can hear this thing always. I have to put a blanket over it so that it doesn't wake me up at 6 in the morning on the weekends. But with these frogs, these tree frogs, even if you had them in your room, I don't think it would be enough to keep you up. They don't really croak that much unless, of course, they're trying to mate, but you can curb that other ways. I've got a whole green tree frog care guide right here if you want to take a look. I really love getting these guys. I wasn't planning to. It was kind of a rescue type thing. I got them from someone who really knew what she was doing with them and wanted them to go to a good home. And I really like to think I gave them a good home. I, just missed them, make sure the temperature's on point, which doesn't get much above 80 degrees. You really want to keep it lower than 80. Mine I keep at around 76, 77, something like that. Have a water receptacle, which I have a pump running through, so I never really have to change it all that often, except for when it evaporates. And then the food source is going to be insects. And that's really fun, too, because they're tree frogs, so they are arboreal. You want the equivalent of a 10-gallon standing up, and you can have up to 3 frogs and something like that. Or get a bigger one and have more frogs, of course. But they're going to jump down to the ground and eat them, and then they'll jump back up. And it's just really fun to watch, and they're really brightly colored green. I've got one that's a little bit more gray, but this green one right here is definitely more vibrant. They're fun to look at, and, if you like frogs, this is a good one to keep because you can have a few of them. So there you go. That's my opinion of the 5 best amphibians you can keep as pets. What do you think? Do you think that there's something I forgot or something I should have excluded from the list? Put it in the comment sections below. And just like this video, I take all the ideas for the videos out of the comment section. So what should I talk about next week? And if you haven't hit that subscribe button already, really appreciate that. And because I do videos twice a week, that means that I'll see you on Monday.